Welcome to StopFake, the place where we uncover disinformation about Ukraine and set the record straight. I'm Peter Dickinson, Chief Editor of Business Ukraine magazine, and I'm happy to present this week's edition. Amongst the fakes this week, we present a story claiming that the President of Ukraine was in hospital with alcohol poisoning. A fake blogger asserts that the Ukrainian government is destroying the country. Another fake claim that President Poroshenko is banning visa-free travel of Ukrainians to Russia. And a misquoted interview claims that Russia's Security Council Secretary wants to send Russian troops into the Baltics as payback for NATO support for Turkey. All this and more in the first 2016 edition of StopFake. Our first fake of the day: Ukrainian President hospitalized with alcohol poisoning. Russian website Optimist published a story claiming that Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko was hospitalized with alcohol poisoning. This fake about Poroshenko was also republished by a number of sites including Holivizor and RU Informer. This is not the first time the Russian media has accused the Ukrainian president of alcoholism. Previously they claimed the source of this information to be the German mass media. Now they attribute the story to one of the most famous BBC correspondents and hard talk presenter Stephen Sakur, whose source is allegedly an unnamed BBC Ukrainian correspondent. The fake story claims that Poroshenko's wife found him, quote, unconscious under a Christmas tree in their garden on the afternoon of January the 1st, unquote. Although the site claims the BBC is the source, there is no link to any such story on the BBC website. There's only a link to the BBC World Service homepage. There's also no such news on Stephen Sakur's Twitter feed or other BBC websites. Predictably, there is also no trace of the story on the Hard Talk homepage. Our next fake: Russian Security Council Secretary wants to send Russian troops into the Baltics. On January the 2nd, the Latvian news portal Vesti LV published a purported interview with the Secretary of the Russian Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, in which he allegedly advocates the introduction of Russian troops to the Baltic states. If the alliance, NATO, will support Ankara, then the most logical answer from our side is the introduction of our troops into the Baltic states. All the Baltics will be ours, completely and without any losses, relatively quickly. NATO pays for the support it offers Turkey with the loss of the Baltic states, writes Vesti LV, allegedly quoting directly Mr. Patrushev. The Vesti LV story was quickly republished by Nepravda in UA. The story also gained considerable traction on social media networks Facebook, Vkontakte and Twitter. Rafat Chubarov, the head of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatars, partially reposted the news from the Latvian site on his own Facebook page. Patrushev, in fact, has not called for Russian troops to be sent into the Baltic states, and he was not interviewed by Vesti LV. Vesti LV reprinted an interview from a Russian website called Svobodnaya Pressa from December 23, 2015, and simply omitted the paragraph stating that the interview was in fact conducted with a certain Mikhail Alexandrov, who is an expert of the Moscow State Institute of International Relations Center for Military and Political Studies. A resume of an interview with Patrushev in which he explains Russia's revised military doctrine from another site preceded the Alexandrov interview on Vesti LV World Affairs page. The call to send Russian military into the Baltics was issued by a Russian academic, therefore, and not by the National Security Council Secretary. Our next fake: President Poroshenko plans to block visa-free entry of Ukrainians to Russia. Russian website Ukraina.ru recently wrote that the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko had announced his intention to introduce new travel documents, which would effectively end visa-free entry into Russia for Ukrainians. However, the travel-related changes Ukraine is contemplating involve complying with European Union requirements so that Ukrainians will be able to travel freely to the EU and, in terms of travel changes, producing a plastic version of the old paper internal passport / identity card. The Russian website said the changes would result in Ukrainians being unable to enter Russia without applying for a visa. All the bureaucratic delays and expenses that would entail would indeed be unpleasant for many Ukrainians who either work or regularly visit relatives in Russia. However, a senior Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman quoted in the Russian article made no warning that Ukrainians would lose visa-free entrance and indicated that any restrictions would only happen after discussion between the two countries and not automatically. In fact, no country can force another to introduce legislation or rules concerning who they allow into their country. Ukraine cannot somehow legislate to prevent Ukrainians entering Russia. Only Russia can prevent Ukrainians from entering the country. Our fourth fake of the day: Ukrainian libraries and museums to begin charging admission, while parents are to be charged for kindergarten children's meals. A number of pro-Kremlin websites have published an article saying that Ukrainian Parliament has adopted laws that will force Ukrainians to pay for a range of services that were previously free, including entry to libraries and museums and other cultural institutions. According to the reports, parents would also have to pay the full cost of kindergarten pupils' meals. An article headlined, "The Ukrainian state has been destroyed. It happened last night," appeared on December 25, 2015, the day after Ukraine's parliament passed a draft bill envisaging new formulas for government funding of public services, some free and others subsidised. However, it transpires that the relevant parliamentary bill, number 3628, and cited by veteran pro-Kremlin dissemblers such as Polit Navigator and Anti-Maidan, does not actually mention imposing charges on libraries and museums, and gives responsibility for such funding to the Cabinet of Ministers. In fact, the bill boosted funding for museums and libraries. Meanwhile, parents already pay part of the costs of kindergarten school meals, and the bill itself only made changes to the formula determining what proportion parents will pay. To verify this, it's possible to study the text of the comparative table to the bill. Next up, a fake blogger presented as a Ukrainian political scientist. The website Golos Pravdy published a news story recently arguing that the Ukrainian president and not the Kremlin was responsible for destroying Ukraine. They cited an imaginary Ukrainian political scientist as the source. The article, entitled "Ukraine's Biggest Enemy Systematically Destroying the Country," is not in the Kremlin but on Bankova Street, which is the seat of the Ukrainian presidential administration. The article contends that Ukraine's government intends to claw back the revenue it loses by imposing sanctions against Russia by forcing ordinary Ukrainians to pay increased rates for electricity and other household costs. The alleged source of the story is a blogger named Valerian Pidmogilny, writing on the Ukrainian magazine site correspondent.net. However, our research shows there is no such political analyst by this name, and the name and accompanying photograph featured on the correspondent site are that of a prominent Ukrainian writer who was executed during Stalin's purges in 1937. Our next fake: Lenta.ru distorts the words of Ukraine's permanent representative at the United Nations. Russia's popular Lenta.ru website used a headline recently which had Ukraine's UN representative Volodymyr Yelchenko apparently dismissing Ukraine's chances of ever regaining sovereignty over Crimea. The Lenta.ru piece cited an interview Yelchenko gave to website Европейская Правда, in which he was asked whether Ukraine's membership for the next 2 years as a permanent member of the UN Security Council would allow Kiev to reassert control over Crimea and Donbass, the areas currently occupied by Russia. Yelchenko's genuine reply to Европейская Pravda's question was that it was unlikely the Crimea and Donbass issues could be resolved within the 2-year term of Ukraine's Security Council membership. He said, quote, "We should not expect that the problem of Crimea and Donbass will be solved in these 2 years. This is unrealistic. It will take a lot longer," unquote. His comments were not an assessment of Ukraine's prospects to eventually return Crimea and Donbass to Ukrainian control, only referring to whether that could be achieved within 2 years. That's all for this week. You can always find fresh fakes on the StopFake website. If you spot any disinformation about Ukraine, please forward it to us. We'll see you next week. Remember to be vigilant, be aware of fakes, and remember that the truth is such a rare thing, it is a delight to tell it. We simply aren't eloquent enough to have thought this up, as the great American poet Emily Dickinson once said. I've been your host, Peter Dickinson, and this is StopFake.